So now we're going to jump into some of the meat of this, the classification of drugs. This is some of the really interesting stuff. Now, I want to say that there are a few different classification systems. We're going to follow the book just to keep it really simple, and I think it is a good, clear way of looking at things. But before we do that, let's talk about some definitions. These are really important. Definitions will end up on exams, so please know these. I've taken a few out because some terminology is used interchangeably, and that got confusing in the past. So these should be very clear to you. If there's anything that you don't understand, let us know. So addiction is a compulsion to use regardless of negative consequences. Chemical dependency is a term that is used to describe addiction to alcohol and/or other drugs and to differentiate this type of addiction to non-chemical addiction. Dependence is a recurrent or ongoing need to use. So dependence has two types, and this is important. This might help you to remember what dependence is. Psychological, which is the need to use a substance to think, feel, and function normally. And physical, and this is when the tissues of the body require the presence of the substance to function normally. Intoxication is the state of being under the influence of a substance so that your thinking, feeling, and our behavior are affected. Psychoactive drugs are natural or synthetic chemicals that affect thinking, feeling, and behavior. And psychotropic drugs are chemicals that are used to treat mental disorders. Okay, those are two that I've seen in the past people struggle with. Psychoactive drugs are the natural or synthetic chemicals that affect thinking, feeling, behavior, and behaviors. Psychotropic are chemicals used to treat mental health disorders or mental disorders. These are very different. I want to make sure that you can distinguish those. Okay, moving on. Tolerance is the need to use more of the drug to get the desired effect. Tolerance differs between different types of drugs, and we'll talk about that next week. Cross tolerance is when there is a tolerance built up to other drugs from the same pharmacological group. Again, this will make a little bit more sense when we start talking about drugs in pharmacological groupings. Reverse tolerance is when smaller quantities are needed to produce the same effect. So let's talk about this one for a minute. We've heard a lot about this recently. So we know that there's a current crisis, right? It hasn't stopped. It has quieted down, right, socially and in the media, but it's still out there, and that's the opiate crisis. So reverse tolerance, we've seen a lot of this because someone may, famous people come to mind, but someone may go to treatment for 28 days to get off of withdraw from and begin to get off of the regular use of an opiate. When they leave, if they go back to using the same amount that they used before, they often overdose. And this is due to reverse tolerance. Some drugs actually go back to the original level of tolerance prior to use. Opiates are one of those drug categories. So when you've stopped using it for a while and you go back to using it, you need much less to get the same effect. This is why people tend to overdose after a period of abstinence. And then withdrawal. Withdrawal is psychological and physical effects that occur when a dependent individual discontinues use, right? So these are the things that your body and mind go through when you stop using. Again, know these well. We're going to talk about them throughout the semester, but I want you to not just memorize them, but understand the context of the words. And I'll try to do that with you throughout the semester to help to solidify that. So let's talk a little bit about how drugs are controlled by the government. There's the Controlled Substances Act. In 1970, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, know that title, understand what it is, was passed by Congress. And basically what this did was place drugs in 5 classes. with the regulatory requirements that are associated with each of these classes or schedules. And there's a little bit more involved in this, but this is the piece that I want you to know. We're going to go through each of these schedules. I'm going to talk about specific drugs in each, but this is the real simple version, okay? If you're really interested in this, you can look up more information because there's a lot. But I just want to get the idea of what this is, what it was meant to be, and how it is currently used to get you thinking about it differently. Okay, so Schedule 1 drugs. These are drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. That's an important sentence. We're going to hear that over and over for the schedules with slight shifts. So Schedule 1 drugs are the most dangerous drugs of all of the drug schedules with potentially severe psychological or physical dependence. And here are some examples of Schedule 1 drugs. So heroin falls in this category. We know this is a problem. LSD, marijuana, ecstasy, and peyote. This is a very small portion of what's in this category. But I want you to take a look at this and see if anything jumps out at you. What I hope happens is that you recognize that marijuana and heroin are scheduled the same under federal law. We're going to get back to that, and we're going to discuss it quite a bit in class, but this still holds true today. Marijuana is a Schedule 1 drug under federal law. Just keep that in mind. Schedule 2, these are drugs with a high potential for abuse, but less abuse potential than Schedule 1 drugs, right? So they have the potential to lead to severe psychological and physical dependence, but again, a little less so than Schedule 2. These drugs are also considered dangerous, and some examples of Schedule 2 drugs include cocaine, methamphetamine, methadone, hydromorphone or Dilaudid, Demerol, oxycodone, Oxycontin, fentanyl. Fentanyl, yes, fentanyl is a Schedule 2, not a Schedule 1. Dexedrine, Adderall, and Ritalin. You're starting to see a pattern here. Schedule 3 drugs are drugs with a moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence. These are drugs with abuse potential that is less so than Schedule 1 and 2 drugs, but more than Schedule 4. So again, here are some examples. This is when you start to see things like combinations of products, products with 15 milligrams of hydrocodone per dose, like certain doses of Vicodin. Products containing less than 90 milligrams of codeine, Tylenol with codeine, for example. Ketamine or Special K, some anabolic steroids, and testosterone will fall into Schedule 3. Schedule 4 drugs, drugs with less potential for abuse and a very low risk of dependence comparatively. And here are some examples of that. Xanax, Soma, Darvon, Darvocet, Valium, Ativan, Talwin, and Ambien. Again, take a look at this and read it again. Drugs with a low potential for abuse and low risk of dependence. Does anything stand out here? Write down any thoughts you have and anything you'd like to discuss next class. What stands out for me? Xanax, Ambien. Yep, high medical use, definitely. Not so sure about the low potential for abuse and low risk of dependence. And then there's Schedule 5 drugs. And these are drugs with the lowest potential for abuse. And they consist of preparations containing limited quantities of certain narcotics. Schedule 5 drugs are generally used for cough suppressants, antidiarrheal, antitussive. So they're basic analgesic purposes. These are things you're going to get over the counter for the most part. Sometimes today you have to show a license to do that, but they're mostly over the counter. So there is some hypocrisy and some concerns about the scheduling of the drugs. Remember, this was done back in 1970, so we've learned a lot since then. But there's a lot that goes into the scheduling of drugs. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of politics. and a lot of power behind these decisions, and they're difficult to change. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead and you're probably more savvy than I. You may be able to get on this from here, but if you can't, cut and paste this YouTube video. It's very brief, into your browser so you can take a look at this. I'm hoping that it gets the idea of how this works and what's happened specifically around marijuana in the past. So as I was mentioning earlier, when we were going through the drug schedule, there's a concept of dangerousness involved, right? Part of that level of dangerousness is whether or not the drug has a high probability of dependence. But there are other things that can make a drug dangerous. For example, there is little acute danger in ingesting a glass of wine, of course, by an adult 21 years or older. However, the acute danger of shooting cocaine is far greater, right? So in the moment, one is far worse than the other. While chronic use of any drug has far greater risk. But for example, the dangers of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day for 40 years far outweigh the dangers of drinking a single beer or a single glass of wine a day for 40 years. Also, the way a drug is used increases its level of dangerousness. So the faster a drug can make it into your bloodstream, so, from smoking to ingesting to shooting into a vein, right, the more chance of acute danger. It builds. So to illustrate what this looks like, I'd like you, again, to take a minute, copy this out into your browser, and watch this video. It gives you an example of how the brain works when it is on drugs. There's a slight difference in the mechanisms that are used, that are affected in the brain and how they are affected. But what I want you to really notice and recognize and remember is that dopamine is the key here.